Excellent. Thanks everyone for bearing with us through that. My name is Alyssa Welch, and I am the program manager for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CASC as we call it. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the October Science Seminar. Today, we're really pleased to welcome Craig Paukert from the University of Missouri and the USGS Missouri Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. Craig will be discussing his current research project with the CASC and share his insight on CASC broadly. Let's see, can I advance the slides? There we go. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah.
If you have been following along and joining us regularly for our monthly science seminars, you'll know we just recently celebrated our 1-year anniversary as the newest Midwest Regional Center for the CASC network. For those of you who are new to the CASC Science Seminars, I'll provide a little more background here before I turn it over to Jess Del Fiacco for announcements, and then over to Craig. We'll leave time at the end for discussion and questions as well. Next slide, please. So in fiscal year 2020, Congress appropriated funding to establish a climate adaptation science center in the Midwest, specifically to address climate issues unique and relevant to our region. And in response to that call for proposals, the University of Minnesota was awarded the host agreement for the Midwest CASC, which is a cooperative agreement between USGS, University of Minnesota, and our consortium of 8 partners around the region, who you can see on the map here. Next slide, please. The Midwest CASC is the 9th regional CASC to become part of the National CASC Network that aims to be responsive to climate adaptation science needs as stated by Department of Interior, tribes, federal agencies, to deliver climate impact and adaptation science to inform future conservation efforts. And at the Midwest CASC, we do this in several specific ways, including conducting synthesis research on topics relevant to the region, supporting postdoc and graduate fellows. In fact, next month at the November seminar, we will be introducing our newest CASC-hosted postdoc, Dee Lobo. So we're excited to have her join then. We also, in partnership with College of Menominee Nation, they lead our tribal undergraduate research program. We had the first one this summer. The CASC also offers capacity building workshops and annual gathering. We hosted our first annual gathering in August in Madison, and many of you may have attended that. And importantly, we fund grants in partnership with USGS to grow the field of climate adaptation research. You have heard in past science seminars us announce some of those projects, and moving forward, we're excited to share more about the PIs and the projects leading those efforts. These activities overall help us to build collaboration across the network of practitioners in the region and advance the science behind these discussions and decisions. And as we move into year 2, we'll be talking more about ways to engage with the CASC through science seminars and in other platforms. So at this time, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jess Del Fiacco, for some important announcements and updates.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Alyssa, for that great introduction. We had a super busy month in October throughout the Midwest CASC network. So I just wanted to highlight a few things here, as well as a couple of things that are coming up in November. If you want to learn more about anything that I mentioned here, you can check out our newsletter, which went out earlier today, as well as our social media channels, where we're sharing information and photos on a lot of these things. So a couple of weeks ago, we sent a cohort of students and postdocs to the National CASC's Early Career Workshop, which was in New Mexico. Holly Emke, who is a researcher with the Midwest CASC, was in Thailand as an embassy science fellow with the State Department. The Indiana University is hiring a postdoc for the CASC Climate Adaptation Postdoctoral Fellows Program, also called the CAP Fellows Program. The CAP Postdoctoral Fellow will lead a regional project focused on the entire Great Lakes. So we encourage you to share that job ad with anyone who you think might be interested. Jessica Hellman, Midwest CASC University Director, will be attending COP27 in Egypt And we're going to feature her on next month's science seminar, sharing some takeaways from that event. So if you're interested, you should make sure to register via the link that I'll share in the follow-up email to this seminar to join us next month. A couple other things. There is an upcoming virtual career event that's hosted by the National CASC for any students who want to learn more about job opportunities in the federal sphere. That's happening on November 9th. And again, more information on everything that I just mentioned is in our monthly newsletter, which went out this morning, as well as our social media channels. And then one final quick reminder that our upcoming seminars are going to be happening in November on the 28th and January on the 23rd. You can also check out our archive on YouTube, which has all of our past seminars archived there if you're curious. I think that's everything. Sorry for a very long list of updates. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the star of the show, Craig Paukert. As Alyssa mentioned, he is the leader of the USGS Missouri Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, as well as a professor at the University of Missouri. Thanks so much for joining us, Craig. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to you.
All right. All right, everyone. Well, thanks for taking the time to listen to some of the work that I've been doing with not only the Midwest CASC, but the Northeast CASC, as well as kind of the national office as well. And I was asked to kind of give a talk a little bit highlighting some of the research, but then also, some advice on kind of engagement and outreach and mentoring. So most of the talk is going to be science-based, and then about the last 10 minutes or so, we'll talk a bit about kind of how I've been able to kind of engage stakeholders and my advice kind of moving forward. So I'm going to talk today about several projects on a kind of a fairly superficial level. We won't get in depth on a lot of them, but I do provide some publication references and actually links to some databases as well. But we're going to kind of start with the idea of, what do we know about climate change and fish? So kind of an assessment of the state of the science. That's kind of our first step is just trying to figure out what's out there, primarily in the peer-reviewed literature for some of the work I'm going to talk about. But then the next step is making that accessible. So it's not just about finding the literature, making it accessible, and in particular, making it accessible and useful to kind of the management and practitioners that will hopefully use this information. So that last box about how do we apply what we know and what's accessible to decisions made by like agency biologists. That's kind of the toughest, in my opinion, kind of the toughest box to deal with. It's a pretty big jump from, what do we know, and then what's accessible, and then that really big jump is then making it applicable to the management questions. And hopefully I'll get into a little bit of that, how we've been achieving that in some projects we have. So as far as what we know, and this graphic is part of a project called FICLY, and there's a reference to a paper by Trevor Krabenoff as the lead author, but we developed this database on climate change and fish, and we published it in a paper, but then also an online database, and you're going to see that here in a few minutes. But really the point of this is to say that when we look at the climate change literature, that maybe around the year 2000 or so, we start to see kind of an increase in papers, particularly related to like projected changes in climate change. So kind of the idea of these vulnerability assessments or just some models to say this is what could happen to fish under climate change scenarios. But maybe roughly around 2010 or so, we start seeing an increase in what we call documented cases. And really what we're getting at here is maybe some long-term monitoring that now has ended up that we can actually see some sort of signal from climate change. So that's been kind of an important distinction, is going from these kind of projected models to actually having enough information to show documented changes. And my kind of evolution in kind of working with the climate change group started, well, actually it started a long time ago, but I'm going to talk about some work that maybe started around 2014 or so. And about that time, the National Cask was approached by AFS, American Fisheries Society, to work on some sort of assessment on North American inland fish and climate change. So that discussion led to them contacting me at Missouri to help lead this effort. So we started kind of thinking about how are we going to do this assessment that will ultimately be a special issue in the journal Fisheries. And we knew we wanted some sort of work group. And we actually sat down in Reston probably around 2015 or so, Doug Beard from the national office and Abby Lynch from the national office and myself, and started brainstorming about who could we pick to be involved in this effort. We really wanted to focus on agency folks, and so we have a fair amount of state and provincial agency folks, although we still have the academics in there as well. But one important thing I want to mention with this is when we were brainstorming about people to bring to this meeting, certainly their expertise in fishery science and climate change were very important, but also what was important is their ability to work with people. There's a lot of really top-notch researchers out there, but there's several that I probably wouldn't work with just based on kind of being difficult to work with, maybe don't meet deadlines or whatever it may be. So we were pretty careful in trying to select people that we knew from personal experience or knew that they were, able to excuse me here, but able to meet deadlines and actually were pleasant to work with. So we had this this group that we ended up in Bozeman, Montana, with this work group, and then the work group was split into 4 subgroups, and one was the effects of climate change on physiology, or kind of the individual fish, then effects of climate change on populations and communities, the human dimensions component of climate change, and then the management. How do we manage fish and develop adaptation strategies? So we met in Bozeman, Montana. And in the end, we came up with this special issue in July 2016 with these 4 papers focused on physiology, populations, human dimensions, and management. And that was really useful, and it actually had some cross-cutting case histories where we're able to use the same case history throughout these 4 papers. And in addition to the publication, we also did a Capitol Hill briefing and did some outreach events as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. So this was certainly kind of a useful document, at least I hope it was. But personally, the real result of this project was this work group, were these people. And what you're going to see throughout my talk is the emphasis on people and kind of working with the right groups. So this 30-person group that initially met in Montana, some of us have still kind of stayed in contact and still done some research projects throughout the years. And in the bottom right is one example from this group with Abby Lynch and Jesse Wong, Bonnie Myers, Trevor Krabenoff, Jeff Falke, Cindy Chu, and then Tom Kwok, who sadly has passed away. So it's been this core 30-person group turned into kind of this subgroup, and we still continue working today. So that's actually been a lot of fun, is working with this group. Fast forward maybe 5 years or so, and Scott Bonar is the president of AFS, and his big work plan focused on climate change. So he approached me to develop a special committee on the effects of climate change on fish. And we focused on adaptation strategies, but also we added we included both marine and freshwater here. And the authors in the orange there are the ones that were part of that initial group in Bozeman, Montana. So we've certainly kept some of the core group. We've added additional folks, particularly related to some of the marine components, coral reef, that type of thing. So we developed this product, this climate change effects on North American fish, just in September of last year for fisheries. And I think this was useful. I mean, I think this took a step farther, more useful compared to the 2016 issue, because we focused on adaptation strategies and hopefully came up with almost a menu. And how the paper is set up is there's several tables within this paper. And we may have like the stressor, like in this example of this table, that warming water temperature is a stressor. What's the potential response to the fish? Changes in vital rates such as reproduction, growth, mortality. So that's a concern. There might be distribution shifts as well related to this warming temperature. But then we have underneath that potential adaptation strategies. And so, for example, I highlighted a few at the bottom here. That one of the strategies was to use ecosystem-based management instead of single stock assessment management. And this is kind of linked obviously to the marine sector, but even in the inland freshwater sectors, to kind of have a diversity of fish out there and potentially diversity of year classes as well. So hopefully that can help buffer the impacts of climate change. And certainly another one that we work a lot in inland fisheries is regulations. Whether you're modifying harvest regulations to adjust to say the winners or losers in related to climate change, and that's a tool that we know well. I mean, fisheries managers know how to regulate fish populations. So this I really liked how this paper kind of came together because we have these adaptation strategies. So it's a little bit of a menu, but it's still a static document. It's still a PDF or a hard copy paper, as well as some other papers. And the one on the right here is led by Bonnie Myers. But all of this is good information. But again, it's kind of tough to really adjust it to your particular question, like if you're a manager. So our next step at that is this FICLI database that I mentioned early on. So this is a paper in scientific data from a couple of years ago, but really the key is we have a Shiny app, and the link is there on the slide to this database. And this database has all the peer-reviewed literature related to climate change in there, and you can select various kind of filters in this. So you could look at certainly different species or families. You can look at documented versus projected changes in climate. Are you interested in, say, temperature effects? Are you interested in kind of growth or distribution effects? So there's a lot of different kind of menu options in this database that then a manager can kind of go through and select what's important to them. And what this does in the end is not only provide you those papers based on your filtered search, but it actually provides kind of a workflow, and the real end result here is these adaptation strategies. So in this example, as far as a filtering, I believe this was stream salmonids and water temperature, if I remember right. But all these papers, so we found 21 papers that had some sort of negative response. So there's a negative response between fish and water temperature, salmonids and water temperature. And those 21 papers had various adaptation strategies that could be implemented to help with this particular issue related to climate change. So it's been pretty nice that you're able to then not only look at the papers and the science, but then at the end look at how people have either recommended dealing with this as an adaptation strategy, or maybe they've actually implemented it as well. So very kind of user-friendly, strongly linked to whatever manager needs you may have. And then another component of this is actually providing some uncertainty metrics or kind of confidence metrics around these results. And I don't have time to go into it a whole lot, but this Lynch et al. Paper, Abby Lynch is led on this, on a recent paper that you can look at, and it actually looks at things like, is a particular fish response, is that supported by, say, lots of literature and a very consistent response, or maybe it's very little literature consistent, or a lot of literature inconsistent. So we can look at kind of how confident we are in that particular result. So a nice kind of addition to this this FICLI database, and that's all built into the database as well. So if we step back a little bit and talk about some kind of my evolution in the climate change work, and I think early on we saw a lot of these vulnerability assessments, kind of landscape scale vulnerability assessments, very useful. The one that I'm showing here is from the Northeast, funded by the Northeast Cask, but looking at how stream fish habitat may change in a changing climate at this kind of larger scale, this Northeastern US scale. So lots of kind of papers like that out there in the literature. In my home state of Missouri, we can drill down a little bit and look at what are some priority stream reaches that are within and outside what we called existing networks or some sort of conservation status network. So not specifically linked to climate change, but you can overlay climate change metrics and say, what are some stream reaches that are of high value, but then also maybe most vulnerable to climate change. But those are all fairly broad, not horribly species specific, and hard to kind of absorb if you're a district biologist saying, what am I going to do in my district? Particularly if, say, you're interested in a particular species, what's going to happen to walleyes or striped bass or whatever species you're interested in. So getting it to that specific management question and management application is still pretty tricky. I'm going to show you some ways that I hope that we're able to do that. And the first one I'm going to talk about is actually an ongoing project funded by the Midwest CASC. And this one is actually a larger project with Gretchen Hansen, Olaf Jensen, and Jordan Reed and myself as the PIs. And Olaf is working on some stock recruitment relationships. Gretchen and I are focused on kind of the growth and energy, like growth and consumption component of this project. But what I'm going to show you now is some preliminary results using a bioenergetics model to look at how changes in climate may affect walleye growth and consumption across a latitudinal gradient. We use diet from the literature for this. The temperature data that we use from current and projected temperature is from Jordan Reed's group, some temperature modeling that they did. Why do we choose walleye? Well, in the Midwest, walleye is king. So, and even down where I'm at in Missouri, certainly not as prominent as Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, but still very important fishery. So we wanted to, we asked managers, like, what are the important species? This is one of them. We're actually going to do several species over the course of the project. When you look at this, what we're looking at here, and you just need to focus on kind of the right half of this figure. The left half is just a lake size, smaller lakes versus larger lakes. The bioenergetics model is an individual based model. So we modeled the average age 3 fish, which is around 373 millimeters. And what we wanted to do is look at the proportion of their diet or consumption increase or decrease based on current conditions. So what we look at here on the right is you can see the 0 as the vertical line. So anything over to the right of that under these climate change scenarios, whether it's mid-century or late century, walleyes up, say, northern Minnesota area are going to need to eat about 5 to 15% more food. And this is really important just to maintain their weight. We initially started this study with what we call a maintenance ration. Start weight equals end weight. So it's not a management goal that we want to just maintain their weight. But so this is saying that just to even maintain their weight, they're going to need to eat more food in those systems. As you head south, kind of to my neck of the woods, you see something that looks a little weird, that we actually see kind of a negative response. This is probably an artifact of the models, but what this means really when we look at the water temperatures in these areas, that there really isn't enough food. I mean, they can't eat enough to maintain their weight. And one of the reasons is the water temperature. So if you look at the number of days above kind of their thermal preference, it's really at 1/3 of the year, 100 days or so, is over their kind of preferred temp range. So things aren't looking good if you're a walleye down in the south. Up north, maybe not too bad, but you are going to still need additional prey availability for these walleyes to kind of maintain the populations that they have. So one question we always got to look into is this useful? And so I'm going to show you an example here of just how we hope that we made this component, this bioenergetics component, as well as the rest of the project useful. And first, we had agency folks on the project, byline. So they were engaged from the get-go on helping with this project and leveraging at times other data that were available through, say, the Glacial Lakes Partnership and other programs. So I think that was very useful to keep us grounded in management. Another component that was useful is we had not too long ago kind of a project update. So we talked to the managers as well as anyone else that joined the call, and we had the update. And in particular, we had breakout sessions for the different components of the project. And one example I'm going to give you is when we went to my breakout session, one question we were wondering with the modeling is, often we use like a surface temperature for the whole year for like modeling, what temperatures that walleye exposed to. But we know if it gets warm, they're probably going to go deep. So that was a dilemma, like which temperature do we use? Certainly above the thermocline, but then do we use an average, above the thermocline or surface temperature? So when we talked to the managers and said, do you see these fish like go deep? And so therefore, should we model some sort of, temperature in the upper part of the lake or reservoir? And they actually said yes, but based on their gillnet catches, they've seen that. So it's nice to get that feedback to kind of know this is what we see in the real world. And then that can help us kind of inform the model and what temperatures we're going to use in this particular model. So that's just one example of how these kind of work groups have been helpful in us kind of adjusting our project. I'm going to switch to another project that is actually, I think, one of the more interesting ones as far as kind of how it evolved and kind of the end product. So working with Abby Lynch and the National Center, we started a project that we call like the replacement cost project. And what this means is the idea is if, say, walleyes go away because of climate change, well, maybe the agency, if they decide to stock, well, that's a cost to stock additional fish. Maybe the angler is going to start heading north to look for walleyes. Well, that's a cost to that individual, maybe a cost to the agency if that's a fishing permit that doesn't stay in their state. So there's kind of different costs associated with climate change. And we talked as we started the project of using kind of the upper Midwest, but maybe even some other regions as well. We actually ended up really focusing on the Midwest, and for several reasons. First, there was a lot of ongoing work in particularly Wisconsin, but also with colleagues from Minnesota that we're looking at climate change effects on Wisconsin walleyes as well as other fish. So we were able to leverage kind of existing ongoing work. But the other components that I think were really important with this is that there's already a strong relationship with the state agency, and Alex and Greg, they're listed on the slide, they were one of the reasons why we went there. We know we had an engaged group. We know we had an interested group. So it was great to just continue those relationships. But I think another component which was interesting about this is we in the end of this, or as we went through this project, we've actually more focused on the Midwest and less focused on other areas. And so it wasn't really a major change in the project, but it did kind of tweak it to have an heavier emphasis on one area. Now, is that an issue, say, from the funding agency? Well, it's been great that Abby and the funding agency has been kind of hand in hand right along with us on these projects. So it's not a surprise when we ended up focusing on that area. So keeping kind of that funding agency engaged, because as you guys know, a lot of them, I mean, they're not just like contract specialists, they're biologists and scientists in their own right. So keeping them engaged, I think, really helped this project. The other thing that helped the project was we have, like I have Colin Dassow here as starred. Well, Colin was a postdoc on the project. We got Colin because of recommendations from the DNR, in particular. Greg said, hey, he's great, hire him for this project. And we're like, that sounds great to us. Well, apparently he was really great, because then, 6 months later, 9 months later, Greg hired him back. So now he's a research biologist with the state agency. But actually, that's good. I mean, that's something that it's really another product of this this project, is actually providing people that are being ingrained right into the state agency. But what Colin actually developed, which is pretty cool, is taking kind of the existing Wisconsin DNR data and their database, and they have some base information on there, lake size, certainly some, lake classification, or, stocking rates, regulations, a lot of information there. What this project tried to do is kind of add this climate change component. So what Colin's been doing, working with, well, now with his agency, the Wisconsin DNR, is to look at the database that Wisconsin has. And this, in this example, this is Lac-Courte is the lake. But what I want to show you is that we have some information here, like this is a complex 2-story lake. Current conditions, it's that lake, and this is based on a lake classification that Wisconsin had. Mid-century, it still stays in the classification, so it didn't change classifications with our kind of climate modeling. But if you look down below here, you see that kind of the current conditions, that probability of supporting adult walleye is really high. And that's good. That means if you stock them, that hopefully they're going to survive. And even natural recruitment in this lake, probability is really high, about 75%. So again, that's encouraging that this lake looks like a pretty good chance it have a self-sustaining natural recruiting population. Fast forward till mid-century or so, those numbers drop a little bit based on our modeling. And so the probability of supporting walleyes, adult walleyes, drops a little bit, not a whole lot, but the probability of natural recruitment actually dropped to about half. So this is the information we wanted to kind of ingrain into the DNR and kind of their decision tools. So now a manager of that lake can use that information to to whatever kind of regulation or management decisions they want to make. So we're really adding in this particular project kind of value added. We have this kind of existing database. Now, how can we incorporate like a climate change angle to their decision making? The next project is one funded by the Midwest CAS that's ongoing. And in a general sense, this is helping agencies develop adaptation strategies for species that were important to them. And we're working a lot with, in this case, the Missouri Department of Conservation, but actually other state and federal partners as well. And one of the concerns we have with this, with climate change and the effects on fish in our part of the country here is some of these small-bodied fish, we don't know much about them as far as kind of their thermal tolerances. And some of the fish are in kind of the, some areas that they may not have a lot of room to escape, that they're up in more headwater systems. So as water temperatures warm, kind of one of the questions that we have is, will the fish be okay? Can it adapt? Does it have some adaptive capacity from a thermal ecology standpoint? And if not, what recommendations can we have to say, allow it to access, say, a cooler water or find another kind of spring-fed system or something that this fish can actually move to? So this project, we're kind of in the middle of it. We're doing actually quite a bit of laboratory work to look at thermal ecology metrics, and then linking that up to stream temperatures as well, with this idea of that if the fish is sensitive to warming temperatures, what can we provide to say the state agency like Missouri Department of Conservation as recommendations for maybe some fish passage to have access to cooler temperatures? And this is led by Brittany Harried, who's a postdoc here at Missouri with myself and Jacob Westhoff. So I gave you a bit of information on kind of the evolution of what we know, kind of the state of the science, some assessments related to climate change, and then how do we make those accessible, and hopefully a little bit of information on how to apply what's available to management decisions. And I still think it's pretty tricky to do, but it's something that obviously is the whole point of us doing this type of work. So it takes effort, and these are what I showed you as some examples of how we've tried to do that. But something that you kind of think about with this type of work and making it accessible and available is like, what's the end goal here? And it depends on kind of your audience and maybe your job. That from that, if you're an academic or even a research biologist like myself in an agency, that things like publication rates and H factors and kind of those academic metrics, those may be important. Certainly, I'd like to think that we all believe that's important to do some sort of species recovery or maybe sustainability or management of, say, sport fish, but some way to help the resource. In our case, kind of the fishes in our neck of the woods. So hopefully that's a goal as well, or an end goal. But then maybe it's public awareness, maybe getting folks aware of the effects of climate change and on fisheries, particularly like in their backyard. So unfortunately, I think the answer to like what's the end goal is all of this, but you still got to know your audience. And some examples that we have for more kind of the decision makers is doing some congressional staffer briefings, and we've done 3 of them related to either extreme events, nature-based solutions, or just climate change effects on fish. And we've done them in different formats, but the important component of this has actually been the American Fisheries Society, who has helped facilitate this, as well as USGS and others. So this is one component of communication to a very kind of specific audience, these climate change staffers. Other audiences are, more on kind of the outreach component, maybe, the general public or even kids. I think the challenge with that in many of our jobs, I bet you a vast majority of people on the call have very little evaluation or in their kind of performance reviews on outreach. This is something that, is, I think, overlooked. And I think it's unfortunate that there isn't a whole lot of emphasis on this. One, because it can be a lot of fun. But also it's very important, regardless of if you're talking to kids or another group. And some examples that we've done is we actually did a kids event at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History several years back with Bonnie Myers and Abby Lynch. And we actually had the kids come in to the museum and then show them, hey, this fish is going to go away from this tub because of climate change. So an interesting kind of component to expose kids to the climate change realm. Then on the flip side, we actually, Brittany Harriet and myself actually gave presentations to a Missouri Master Naturalist group. So public citizens, but obviously have very much an interest in conservation and management and climate change as well. So, getting the word out to these groups, it all takes time, but it's all kind of fun. And, it's easy for me to say everyone should do this. But one example or one suggestion I'd have is I bet you most of your organizations have some sort of, outreach and information branch or social media person or some mechanism to get the information out. We're generally as a group, we don't boast a lot about the work we do. I mean, that's real common in kind of, I think, our field. But it's okay. It's okay to give a call to, your agency's, outreach person and say, hey, here's kind of a cool result that we found, or this is what we're doing. Let's, expose some, children or adults or whatever audience you want to that. So work with people that this has been, done for a living. And along the same lines, one piece of advice that I understand is easier said than done, but I'm really glad I did it, is take advantage of opportunities when they come up. It's hard to really say this opportunity led to this publication or this promotion or whatever it may be, but collectively, these things I think have been really useful. And some examples, and this is also linked very much to the American Fisheries Society, as I mentioned before, that some of the Capitol Hill staffer briefings were actually organized by AFS, and that I was involved in that because of some of my work in the past, but also that I was involved and engaged in AFS to begin with. There's other groups out there too, and one that I listed is called InFish, and this is just really a volunteer group that's interested in kind of valuing inland fisheries. But that group has actually developed some publications, have been almost sounding boards to various organizations on kind of their kind of fisheries issues. So it's been kind of an interesting group that's very easy to join. I mean, you just sign up for it. Another plug would be we have the World Fisheries Congress for the first time in the United States here in 2024. Interested in getting, say, a symposium going or some collaborations globally. There's another avenue to do that. So, these are some of the avenues that have worked for me. I suspect you guys have other avenues that worked, and I'd be curious to hear that at the end of the talk or some people's comments. Probably another one is think carefully about your team members. This goes back to this Bozeman team, which we really were happy with, but I'm sure that there's some people out there that they may be top-notch scientists, but not the greatest collaborators. So, incorporate that decision as far as who you want to work with, as far as who's a good collaborator or team player. That I think is really important. And I think in this Bozeman group that is shown, and the kind of the subsets that came from that really is a testament that we picked the right people because we're still working with them 8-9 years later. So that's really great. The other thing is don't make enemies. It's sometimes easier said than done. But one example I have is I actually published a paper last year, the year before, not too long ago, with a state agency biologist from Minnesota that I knew when I was a Creel clerk in Minnesota, 1995 or so. And that's Pete Jacobson, who's actually in this group. But that's a good example. It almost came full circle. That's really neat to have that interaction. Another piece of advice is that understand your strengths and your weaknesses. And it's okay that you have weaknesses. If you think you're good at everything, you're not. So work with folks that are good at some things that that you're not as good at. And we hear a lot about imposter syndrome. It's real, and there's nothing wrong. No need to apologize for imposter syndrome. And one example that I have related to this is when I got my PhD out of South Dakota State quite a while ago now, 20 years ago or 22 years ago. I had a stats minor, for that for my PhD. I was kind of a go-to person early in my career for statistics. And at that point, SAS was the statistical program. Some of the older folks, I'm sure, know that. Some of the younger ones may not even know this existed, but R was just kind of in its infancy about that time. But then, as well as my beard got grayer and I kind of elevated into various other positions, I know very little about R, next to nothing. And there's a lot of new statistical techniques out there that I'm really not that familiar with. I mean, I'm familiar on a superficial level, but not in any great depth. So if we're looking for a project team that has some quantitative needs, I'm going to look for someone with those quantitative skills. It's okay that I don't have those. You just work with someone that does have them. I can kind of say the same thing about someone with great communication skills and advice for doing some of these outreach events. Look to people that have those talents. I want to end with really if you're going to remember one thing from this talk, it's the people. Work with people that you want to work with. And that's been really rewarding in my career, but really kind of a lot of fun too, because as some of these people retire, move on to other jobs, we may fold in like a new person, and so it's also a little bit of kind of recruitment into our kind of our circle, and it's been really kind of neat. And a couple I want to highlight. I'm sure I missed several names on this slide because there's a ton of them, but first and foremost, I want to highlight the students and postdocs that are really doing a lot of the work with me, and they make me look good. So I'm really happy about that. A couple other folks I really want to highlight is Abby Lynch, who you've heard, and I believe is on the call, but she's been a great collaborator, and really we've worked on a lot of different projects over the years, and it's great to have that relationship. Another person is Doug Beard, the chief of the casks, but maybe for a different reason than you may think. So Doug and I go way back when he was actually just leaving kind of Wisconsin DNR for the feds. But he told me, and I don't even know if he remembers this, but this was years ago, says, you researchers, what you're going to do is just at the end of a project say more research can be done. What can we do now? And that's always resonated with me is, yeah, we're always going to have more research, but what can we do with the information we have now? And another I guess big thanks in this group are two people that probably aren't on the call and don't even know I've mentioned their names, but Doug Nygren, who is the former fish chief at Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, and Chris Vitello, who had the similar position at Missouri Department of Conservation. And I've talked to both these folks years ago about climate change and what can we do to kind of help their state agencies. And one issue that came up is climate change is such this kind of big nebulous issue that it's hard to kind of think of what can you do if you're a district fisheries biologist in Southeast Kansas or Northwest Missouri. So that's always resonated with me too, is how can we make this useful to that biologist, sitting somewhere, in the country that really is interested in salmonids or walleyes or bluegill or whatever they're managing. So trying to keep that in mind as we kind of look at how to make this information useful to managers. And that's the end of my slides. So I guess I'll turn it over to, I guess, questions, but I'm also curious if I'd like to hear kind of other people's advice for kind of engagement and outreach events, because these are just my examples. I'm sure there's a ton more out there. So I'll shut up and open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Greg. I just wanted to say folks are welcome to turn their videos on and pop off mute. If you'd like to ask your question, you're also welcome to put it in the chat. We do have a couple of questions from Olivia in the chat if you want to start with those, Craig.
Yeah, one to spice you up on learning from wildlife, Craig.
Okay, let's see.
So in short,
Yeah.
right, I think we've learned a lot from fisheries. In many ways, you all have been ahead of wildlife on climate and adaptation. But anything that you see happening in the wildlife sector on impacts and adaptation that you're like, oh, I wish we had moved this farther more quickly.
So move kind of the fisheries work more quickly.
Yeah,
so
like
wildlife can learn.
Something that wildlife has done well in terms of concepts. So like, let's say refugia or adaptive capacity. I mean, at least refugia fisheries has done a decent job, but is there anything in terms of cross-disciplinary learning that you look at on the wildlife side, or do you just never look at wildlife stuff? And so
Yeah, I never look at wildlife stuff.
there we
It's kind
go.
of
There's
evil.
the answer.
Right. Actually, so one thing I can think of offhand is migrations, and this might be because my colleague in the co-op unit, Lisa Webb, is a wetland and waterfowl ecologist, so I get this chatter about wildlife is important all the time. But the idea of like kind of these landscape level effects, and as animals are migrating, whether it's caribou or mallard, and looking at kind of potential stopover sites and kind of what's available at the stopover sites, like from either a refugia area or food availability or something like that. I think one component I think wildlife is ahead of us on is more of those kind of land use, satellite imagery type of work, partly because often we can't penetrate the water. I mean, we know where the water is, and we use a lot of landscape level kind of terrestrial variables, urban and ag land use. But I think with the ability to kind of see the land in the wildlife, I think that's helped quite a bit.
Thanks, Fred. Do you want to skip down to Dana's question?
Oh, there's Dana. Okay. What would you identify as some of the bigger unknowns related to climate change and freshwater fish? So, I would say a couple things, but first and foremost, and this is more kind of as a group, that we know very little about a lot of different species as far as their kind of physiology, life history, and talking about more of these kind of small-bodied fishes. I mean, there's and you saw it in my talk. There's like a lot of research on walleyes in the upper Midwest, and that's great. And there's research on other species in the upper Midwest. You get into the Appalachians of the Rocky Mountains, and we have quite a bit of research on salmonids and the effects of climate change and maybe going to higher elevations. But what we don't have a lot of is what's going to happen to these tons of small-bodied fishes, native cyprinids out there. Do they have the adaptive capacity, and then to adjust to climate change? But then also, I think these non-lethal effects of climate change. I mean, we often talk about, and the vulnerability assessments kind of linked to this, is kind of presumption is the fish isn't going to do well in a certain river reach in the future, or maybe not be present, or may die. But and this is kind of where I am in the central part of the U.S. We have channel catfish, large and smallmouth bass, bluegills. These are all fish that are not going to die, because of climate change. But will there be kind of altered reproductive cycles or migrations or things like that? So I think we're kind of missing the non-lethal components of climate change effects on fish as well.
So Craig, I'll ask another question. So you talked about making sure you pick good people to work with. What else would you say for early career professionals in terms of like assembling, but also advancing, like actually getting work out of these collaborative, like these new research collaboratives? Do you have any other advice?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think the easy answer is pick the right group. And that's something that I really kind of will highlight Abby Lynch in this, is that she's great at kind of compiling these groups, identifying kind of folks, with this, interest, but then keeping things moving along. And I think that's really important to have someone like that. And part of the reason is some of these groups that I'm talking about, they're not necessarily like funded contracts. So, you know, we may meet on a weekly or monthly basis or whatever, and it's really up to the group to say, give a presentation or publish, and that's work. We've actually done quite a bit of that, but it's all because we have some people that want to be there and aren't there just because of a contractual obligation. But then also we have some of the leaders, and Abby's one of them, that keeps the group moving. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I'd invite Abby. I think you're still on, right? If you want to unmute. Yeah, I know how Abby keeps things moving. Abby, do you want to share a couple of your tips?
I think she might have popped off, actually. I see that her name has turned to gray, so we missed
we
the
missed
chance.
it.
I would actually, Craig, if I could follow up with that, I'd love, you gave some amazing advice for early career researchers on your call. I really appreciate that. I know that we have a couple from our network on this call as well. How can they demonstrate that they can be a part of this kind of trusted group as well, right? We struggle with that sometimes, I think, in our circles as well, that you want to be sure that you're going to people who are tried and true and great partners and have demonstrated that, but you also want to be sure that you're expanding into new people and new researchers that are coming up. So how can they identify themselves as someone that is going to be a good partner if they haven't already demonstrated that?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I'd say that's kind of the flip side of this, like how I've talked about, like identifying folks is there is that good old boy component to that we're selecting folks either because we know of them, worked with them in the past, or maybe someone else has worked with them, kind of a friend of a friend type of thing. But I would say probably the to get that kind of foot in the door with these groups is start attending, whether it's like TWS, AFS, like working groups or things like that. And I mentioned this InFish group that anyone can join and just kind of sit in. But then on those calls, it's not uncommon for us to say, hey, we have a question, or this is, we want some advice related to this particular topic. Is anyone willing to kind of do that? So I think just getting your foot in the door with these, kind of groups. But I do understand, I don't have a great answer for this, is finding those groups, and it's tough. And I think to me, it's very much like trying to define kind of a straight line between like being involved in professional society and whatever kind of metrics of success you have, publications or whatever. So you might have to do a lot of things in professional society that ultimately kind of lead into kind of being, that trusted partner, as you said. So a little bit of it, in my opinion, is kind of, hit or miss. I mean, you try, you work with groups. If it's not your fit, you kind of, back out and look for another group. But I'd say that's, volunteering, for, AFS, TWS. I think people get, get almost intimidated. Like AFS has sections. I know TWS does as well. But, do you want to run for, an officer in a section? There's not a ton of competition for many of those positions. So it's okay to kind of run and just get your foot in the door.
Good advice. Thank you. We had another question, and I think Abby joined back in.
Yeah, Olivia mentioned here just in the chat about, kind of working groups with the state agency, or any agency for that matter. But if you have a good relationship with your kind of local state agency, I think that's a great place to start too. And often, and I'm biased because in the Cooperative Fish and Life Research Unit, I mean, that's really part of our kind of our job is to really directly work with the state agencies. But is there an opportunity that you can go and talk to them and say, what are some needs you have, or how can I help you? And that just maybe springboards into, maybe working with them on a project or getting engaged at some sort of work group. So Abby's back.
Yeah, Abby, you're.
I'm here. Sorry, I if I missed something, I apologize.
Oh, you're fine. You didn't know you were going to be called out, Abby. We were talking about how you're really good about keeping groups moving forward, research collaborations. What are one or two of the things that you do to
Oh gosh, you guys are putting me on the spot here. So
We sure are.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that sentiment. And I guess in terms of, I mean, just hearing what Craig was saying, I think, there are some groups that kind of gel and work well together, and then those groups often end up leading to other kind of spin-off projects too. And as Craig mentioned earlier on, I think, if you can kind of look ahead from the outset to trying to identify, collaborative people, those are the ones you want to hold on to, and those are the ones that work well together. And so those, I would say, yeah, kind of identifying not only like topic experts, but also people that are, will be a good team members has been very helpful. And yeah, on my end, in terms of a number of the groups that Craig and I have been involved with together, I think, sometimes it can be difficult when you have a large group to really get started on something. And so I've found, in my experience, if you give something for everyone to comment on, that's a lot easier than asking people to like just jump in and start something new. So it's a lot easier if there's a baseline for people to build from. Hopefully that's somewhat along the lines of what you were saying, Craig, and I apologize for missing a couple minutes of the seminar.
No, that's okay, Abby. Yeah, I punted to you and said, when we asked about kind of how do you develop these relationships, and Abby is great at kind of keeping things moving, identifying that team and keeping them moving. And that's the real, the identifying team may be the easier part. The harder part is actually keeping it moving to some sort of, goal. And, one thing again that I think is tough, and I recognize this, that it's easy to say this stuff. It's easy to say, get involved in professional society, do outreach. It all takes time. And I wish I had a magic wand to kind of say, yes, go and do this, and this will help in a performance evaluation. But that's, I think, the balance that we have is often, as I mentioned with outreach, like that would be kind of on top of our regular duties of doing science. So I wish outreach would be, more incorporated into kind of performance evaluations. And maybe they are, and I'm just not aware of it. But that's the balance here too, is trying to figure out what you have time for. Because I will say, as far as being a good collaborator, cooperator, if you join a group, say if you're new and you join a group, be engaged, be active. If there is a task for reviewing, edits or something like that, as Abby mentioned, contribute. Because that if you're too busy to be part of the group, or you kind of just don't respond, then you won't be asked to be part of the group at the end. So if you're willing to be engaged, stay engaged.
Thanks so much, Craig. We are down to, it's 1 p.m. right now, so we need to close out. I'm going to pop up a couple poll questions. So if you would really appreciate if you can answer these before you hop off the Zoom.